"Trust me, I'm here with you," said the struggling single dad to the heiress. An heiress pressured by her mother to accept an arranged marriage, and a single father struggling to raise his daughter alone cross paths under unexpected circumstances. Between responsibilities, losses, and new discoveries, they build an unlikely bond that defies prejudice and proves that family can be born in the most unexpected places. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel Hayes walked across the Brooklyn Bridge that night, carrying little Grace in his arms. The 3-year-old was curled up inside her father's worn coat, her cheek resting against his shoulder. They had spent the day at a routine checkup at the children's hospital, and on the way out, Daniel wanted to surprise his daughter by taking her to a nearby square to play a little before heading home. She ran, laughed, and played until she was tired, but the weather turned too quickly. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, and the rain poured down, forcing them onto the bridge under cutting wind. His coat wasn't enough to keep her completely warm, so Daniel quickened his pace, hoping to reach their small Brooklyn apartment as soon as possible. He was used to hard days, but that night felt heavier. As he walked, his thoughts returned to the wife his daughter had never met. The memory still ached. Grace had been born healthy, but her mother had passed away only hours after delivery, victim of an unexpected complication. Since then, every walk in the rain was also a reminder of the loneliness he carried. The wind grew stronger by the minute, whipping his face and making Grace stir in his arms. Daniel adjusted her, whispering that they would be home soon. That was when he noticed a figure up ahead, standing at the edge of the bridge, motionless against the iron rails. At first, he thought it was just someone watching the city, but instinct and a father's protective reflex made his heart race. That posture was not normal. Step by step, the details became clear. A dress plastered to the skin by rain, blonde. Hair clinging to her face, arms stretched out as if ready to give herself to the void. Daniel's body tensed all at once. She was about to jump. His heart pounded violently, his stomach churned, his breath caught short. Fear was not only for her, but also tied to everything he had already lost. Sensing his father's tension, Grace clung even tighter to his neck. But Daniel had no choice. He had to run. He rushed forward, shouting for her to wait to stop. The storm swallowed his voice, but the young woman turned her head toward him. In that instant, a sudden slip gave away what was coming. Her foot skidded on the slick railing. Without thinking, Daniel lunged forward, nearly dropping Grace, and grabbed the stranger's wrist at the last possible second. The impact slammed his knee against the iron structure. Pain so sharp that tears sprang to his eyes. Still, he didn't let go. Grace began crying, frightened by the jolt and the desperation on her father's face. With one arm, he held his daughter tightly to his chest. With the other, he tried to pull the young woman back. The weight of her body, combined with the driving rain, nearly dragged him over the edge. For a split second, he believed he didn't have the strength to hold them both. "Don't let go, please," the girl cried, her voice trembling, barely audible through the storm. "I can't anymore. I can't go on." Daniel clenched his teeth, his muscles burning with fire. "You're not alone. I'm right here," he shouted back, trying to stay firm even as his body screamed in pain. Every false move could drag all three of them into the dark water below. Rain made everything slippery. The iron was freezing, and her weight seemed to double with each passing second. Grace sobbed, calling out to him between hiccups, and that sound sparked something inside Daniel. With a hoarse yell, he pulled harder, pushing through the pain. His leg throbbed, but his body obeyed. Inch by inch, he dragged her back until finally, with a desperate surge, he hauled her inside the railing. He collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping, his daughter clinging to him and the stranger trembling beside them. For long moments, they just sat there, breathless, unable to speak. The young woman sobbed, hugging her knees, her soaked hair plastered against a pale face. Daniel adjusted Grace on his lap and stretched out his free hand to her shoulder. "You're alive, that's what matters," he said firmly, trying to lend her calm. She lifted her tear-filled eyes, muttering something he could barely hear. Daniel realized he couldn't leave her alone on that bridge. Whoever she was, wherever she came from, he had just saved her life, and that made him responsible. For her, at least for tonight. Looking out at the emptiness of the bridge, lit only by distant headlights, he made the decision that would change everything for all three of them. He would take her home. The walk back was silent. The young woman kept close beside him, hugging. Her arms moving slowly with trembling legs and bare feet scraped by the concrete. Daniel held Grace securely against his chest and glanced back often to make sure the stranger wasn't stopping. The rain had eased, but the cold winds still stung. When they reached the old building where he lived, Daniel pushed open the heavy iron door and climbed the narrow stairs. The corridor was dim, smelling of peeling paint and damp carpet. He unlocked the door to the small apartment, tucked Grace into bed, and finally turned to the girl he had rescued. The contrast was stark. She looked out of place in the humble space, yet made no move to leave. She just stood there, drenched, unsure of what to do. Daniel let out a long breath, grabbed a clean towel, and handed her a set of clothes he still kept from his late wife, something to cover herself with. Then he set water on the stove and brewed coffee. The young woman accepted both towel and cup with a hesitant look, but little by little, warmth returned some color to her cheeks. They sat across from each other, only a small kitchen table between them. Daniel studied her discreetly. There was more to her than fragile appearance. He recognized the same weight of grief he carried himself. The silence that grew wasn't uncomfortable, but a quiet acknowledgement. He understood that the night was far from over. The small kitchen was warmed by the steam rising from freshly brewed coffee, while the silence between them became almost tangible. Isabella, still dressed in the loose clothes that had once belonged to Daniel's late wife, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and kept her eyes fixed on the cup in her hands, as if searching for an escape from the storm raging inside her. Daniel, seated across the table, noticed her fingers trembling slightly around the chipped porcelain. For a few moments, the only sounds were the ticking of the wall clock and the steady breathing of Grace coming from the bedroom next door. It was Isabella who finally broke the silence, her voice faltering on the first words. She spoke of losing her father not long ago, and how since then her life had been dictated entirely by her mother. Eleanor not only decided the future of the company, but also her daughter's fate. An arranged marriage with the heir of another powerful family. "I feel like I'm just a bargaining chip, not a person," she murmured, eyes brimming with tears. Daniel stayed quiet, absorbing every word. What she described was a world far removed from his own, yet the pain was something he understood all too well. He watched the young woman fight back her tears, as if exhausted from always appearing fragile, and felt an unexpected impulse to share his own story. Taking a deep breath, he spoke, for the first time in a long while, about the night everything had changed. He told her Grace had been born strong, crying loudly, but her mother never left the delivery room alive. A sudden complication had taken her life in a matter of hours. He remembered standing frozen, not knowing whether to celebrate or to grieve. He remembered the hollow ache in his chest when he held his newborn daughter without the woman he loved. By his side, his voice faltered, but he pushed through. Since then, every day has been a fight. I work wherever they'll take me, any shift, and when I come back home, it's her smile that keeps me standing, he said, nodding toward his daughter. The words lingered between them, heavy with the weight of exposed wounds. Isabella raised her eyes and held his gaze in silence. He wasn't trying to diminish her pain with platitudes, but instead acknowledging it. "I feel like I lost my footing when my father died," she confessed softly, "and no one has let me decide who I want to be. My mother only talks about business, alliances, deals, and me. All I want is to breathe." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding instantly. "We think we're in control of life," he replied. "But the truth is, it takes away what matters most without asking permission." For a moment, they stared at each other, their different stories converging at the same point. Loneliness thought the night deepened and the rain outside subsided, but the weight of their conversation kept them awake. Isabella set her cup down on the table and drew in a shaky breath. "On the bridge, I didn't really want to jump. I just didn't know how else to say I couldn't take it anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking. Daniel's chest tightened. He remembered her slippery hand in his, the desperate strength it had taken not to let go. "I'm glad you didn't let that moment define your life," he said firmly, "because you still have the chance to change everything." Her eyes flickered, surprised to hear such words from a man who had so little, yet carried so much strength. Grace stirred softly in the bedroom, and Isabella turned her head toward the sound. That small detail brought a fragile tenderness to the moment. "She's lucky to have you," Isabella whispered. Daniel stood, went to check on his daughter curled up with her stuffed bear, and returned with a weary half-smile. "The truth is, I'm the lucky one. Without Grace, I don't know if I would have kept going." Isabella lowered her eyes, feeling her own reflection in his words. Maybe she, too, needed to find something or someone that gave her reasons to keep moving forward. Their conversation drifted on with long pauses, not because there was nothing left to say, but because sometimes silence spoke louder. Daniel rose to collect the cups, while Isabella sat still, clutching the fabric of the borrowed clothes as if it were the only solid thing in her life. By the time he returned, she was already lying on the sofa, wrapped tightly in the blanket, exhausted. He paused for a moment, watching her. Her face showed the weight of an enormous burden, yet in that instant she seemed able to rest. He turned off the light in the living room, leaving only the faint glow from the kitchen, and then went to lie down in the bedroom beside his daughter. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but one thing was clear. This night had changed everything. Dawn crept softly through the worn curtains of the living room. Isabella stirred slowly, her body still aching from the tension of the previous night. The loose shirt she wore carried the faint scent of ordinary soap, so different from the expensive perfume she was used to, and it left an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. When she lifted her eyes, she noticed Daniel standing in the kitchen, preparing Grace's breakfast with simple, practiced movements. The sound of the kettle whistling blended with the faint murmur of the little girl waking up in the bedroom. Isabella hesitated, unsure if she should stay or hurry out, but before she could decide, Grace ran to her, hair tousled, clutching her stuffed bear. "Are you feeling better?" the child asked with curious innocence. Isabella forced a smile and nodded. Daniel observed in silence, trying to make sense of what it meant to have this woman in his home. After a modest breakfast, Isabella whispered her thanks and stood, asking for her wet clothes back. Daniel handed them over, neatly folded, but he noticed her lingering as she returned the borrowed garment from his late wife. He didn't comment, only placed it back in the far corner of the closet where it had stayed untouched since the loss. Isabella left quickly, but before reaching the door, Grace dashed forward and grabbed her hand, reluctant to let her go. Isabella crouched, exchanged a long look with the girl, and promised she would visit again one day. Daniel said nothing, simply walked her to the hallway and closed the door behind her, the sound echoing through the old building. Back at the Manhattan penthouse, Isabella found her mother already seated at the table, perfectly composed even at an ordinary breakfast. Eleanor Montgomery lifted her eyes from the newspaper and wasted no time starting the interrogation. She demanded to know where her daughter had spent the night, why she looked so worn, and when she planned to accept the engagement proposal that was practically settled. Isabella avoided details, only saying she needed space, but Eleanor refused. To tolerate excuses, "You are Montgomery. You have responsibilities you cannot ignore," she declared coldly. The words pressed on Isabella like a sentence. There was no room for choice, only obligations. Isabella drew a long breath, keeping her night in Brooklyn locked inside her chest. While Isabella faced her mother in Manhattan, Daniel left for another day of work. He pulled on his worn jacket, dropped Grace off with Mrs. Jenkins, and descended the building's narrow steps carrying tools for yet another temporary job. The work was grueling and poorly paid, but it kept food on the table and rent covered. The memory of the previous night lingered, especially Isabella's hollow look when she confessed to feeling like a bargaining chip. Daniel wondered who exactly she was, where she came from, and why she carried so much to spare when she seemed to have everything. But he didn't allow himself to dwell on it. Life didn't give him room for speculation. The day dragged on for them both. Isabella endured a boardroom meeting where directors watched her with thinly veiled condescension, waiting for her to stumble with every word. She held her composure, recalling her father's lessons from when they had worked side by side. Daniel, on a makeshift construction site, felt his calloused hands split further under the weight of cement and rusted tools. Each in their own world, they wrestled with burdens they had never chosen. Isabella longed to own her decisions without her mother's approval hanging over her. Daniel longed to give his daughter a dignified future, no matter the cost, and sleepless nights dotted day's end. Isabella retreated to her luxurious bedroom, but found no comfort there. The silence of the Manhattan apartment was as suffocating as the weight of expectation. In Brooklyn, Daniel tucked Grace into bed, humming a half-remembered lullaby from his childhood. Their universes did not cross that night, yet they were tethered by something neither could define. Darkness settled over New York, carrying the same biting wind that had swept across the bridge. Isabella stayed awake, staring out at the glittering cityscape, while Daniel switched off the last light in his small apartment, both quietly aware of how quickly life could shift in the span of a single night. The glass tower of Montgomery Enterprises mirrored Manhattan's gray sky as Isabella crossed the lobby with determined steps. The sharp sound of her heels setting a rhythm she forced upon herself to avoid crumbling under the whirlwind of the past days. The doorman greeted her with formality. Receptionists lowered their eyes back to their screens, and a few executives in the elevator cut their conversation short when she stepped in. Together, it all formed the familiar chorus of expectation she had known since adolescence, when she used to walk these same corridors alongside her father. She went straight to the executive floor and requested the full reports on the Hudson shipyard project before noon, a legacy endeavor that had drained both cash and patience. She asked for detailed cash flow broken down by supplier, all contract amendments, actual versus promised timelines, and a risk map including penalties, delays, and environmental liabilities. The council assistant blinked in surprise, but noted everything down. Isabella entered the glass-walled boardroom and sat with her notebook open, writing by hand the points she intended to demand. She showed no hesitation, softened no tone. By the time the directors filed in one by one, she had already decided the first agenda: transparency. There would be no room for evasive phrases or half-truths. The CFO began with colorful slides and the familiar refrain of conjunctural challenges, a phrase often used to cover poor choices. Isabella cut in, pulled the raw spreadsheets toward herself, and scanned the numbers. She flagged duplicated charges for site preparation, questioned price discrepancies in steel purchased from different suppliers in the same month, and demanded written technical justification within 48 hours. The operations director, visibly uneasy, tried to steer the discussion toward communication and market perception, but Isabella dragged it back to execution metrics. She asked for photographic evidence of on-site progress, daily logs signed by resident engineers, and a revised timeline with weekly milestones. She ended by calling for an independent external audit focused solely on the project, with full access to all contracts and amendments, along with a governance review of the supervising committee. Her voice never rose. Her demands were structured, orderly, and precise. The silence at the end spoke louder than the polite applause that once accompanied boardrooms, where her last name was used as a substitute for real oversight. In the hallway afterward, her encounter with her mother was sharp and brief. Eleanor, trailed by the family's legal counsel, remarked that Isabella's presence on the project was reckless and that a public engagement announcement with an allied family son would stabilize market perception. Isabella inhaled deeply and answered without raising her tone. The perception that mattered was that of investors who saw results, numbers, and deliveries, not social contracts disguised as business deals. Eleanor countered that image and solidity were inseparable, insisting her late husband never blurred the two. Isabella replied that what she had learned from her father was to check numbers, visit sites, and hear from the ground crews before approving extra costs. She asked her mother to let her work and informed her she would be visiting the Hudson site twice a week with a small technical team and no photographers. It wasn't a shouting match. It was a clash of visions, one clinging to social alliances, the other to evidence-based management. The legal advisor opened his mouth to intervene, but stopped when Isabella politely requested he deliver to her all umbrella contracts signed in the past year for performance clause review. The exchange ended in the elevator, mother and daughter going separate ways, leaving the hallway to the background hum of phones and hurried steps. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Daniel dropped Grace off with Mrs. Jenkins, her coat buttoned tight and lunchbox ready. The neighbor hugged the little girl briefly, as she did every morning, and asked the father if he had slept at all. Daniel replied with that familiar half-smile that carried both fatigue and care, told her he'd be back in the afternoon, and descended the stairs with his toolbox. The day's work included small repairs in nearby apartments and a delivery shift at a supply depot that paid by the hour. On the way, he checked the month's bills in his pocket, mentally reorganized priorities, and reminded himself to buy children's cough medicine if the rain continued. At the first job, an old leak tested his patience. Plumbing tape, washers, trial and error until the dripping stopped. At the depot, he hauled crates, pulled a cart with stiff wheels across cracked cement, accepted another extra hour to make up for a late payment, and texted Mrs. Jenkins to save Grace's newest drawing so he could look at it calmly that night. His day held no grand events, only a chain of responsibilities and small victories no one applauded. Back at the company, Isabella spent the afternoon with the legal and finance teams, combing through adjustment clauses and measurement criteria, assigning clear responsibilities and deadlines, and establishing a reporting system to the board twice a week with no marketing touch-ups. When someone suggested a press release to calm the market, she asked what new facts they had to announce beyond promises, and the room went quiet. Later, she called the chief engineer up to the terrace and listened carefully to what blueprints don't reveal. Delays from poorly designed access for trucks, a contractor running with reduced staff, logistics bottlenecks stealing half an hour from every delivery. Isabella noted each issue, asked what required a decision versus execution, authorized immediate correction of the access problem, and approved reinforcement for the critical team. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, she closed her notebook and looked out at the city, not as scenery, but as work. There was no relief, but there was a plan, and that was enough to carry her steps back through the office doors. Night fell, with Manhattan's cold pressing in and the smell of food wafting through Brooklyn windows as Daniel returned home, his arms sore and shirt damp. Mrs. Jenkins greeted him at the door with Grace in her arms, mentioning the little girl had spent part of the afternoon drawing a bridge with two figures holding hands and a teddy bear in the corner, then napped clutching that same bear. Daniel listened, thanked her, picked up his daughter, and climbed the stairs slowly, carrying the good weight of the day's end. At home, he boiled pasta, saved a smaller portion for tomorrow's lunchbox, helped Grace with her bath, read 2 pages from a worn picture book, turned off her light, and sat quietly at her bedside until her breathing steadied. In the living room, the coat he had lent out was no longer draped over the chair. It had been folded and put away, as every used item returned to its place. Daniel washed the dishes, hung the towel, and stood for a moment at the window, not searching for meaning, just resting his eyes. Across the city, Isabella closed her notebook and laid her pen aside, fully aware that tomorrow would bring more numbers, more questions, more decisions. The following days dragged on between reports, meetings, and the wary looks inside Montgomery Enterprises. Isabella kept her posture steady, but when she returned to the penthouse, the silence pressed down on her like a weight. Eleanor repeated her mantra daily. Her daughter must accept the engagement, reminding her that the family's image was at stake. Isabella listened, but the words no longer pierced as they once had. The nights felt endless, and the memory of that modest Brooklyn apartment lingered. Daniel's little girl smiling with her teddy bear, the strong coffee served in chipped mugs, the raw honesty in his voice when he spoke of his wife. A world so starkly different from hers, yet somehow more real than the luxury surrounding her. One evening, while opening a drawer in her desk, she came across a children's book her father used to read to her. The idea sparked instantly to bring it to Grace. A simple gesture, one that would justify her visit, but also rekindle something she could not push from her mind. On Saturday afternoon, Isabella asked the driver to let her out 2 streets before Daniel's building. She wanted to avoid curious neighbors or the photographers who sometimes shadowed the Montgomery family. She walked quickly, book in hand, and when she stood before the heavy iron door, her heart beat faster than it had. Years. Climbing the narrow steps, she knocked softly. Daniel took several seconds before opening, wearing a worn t-shirt, his expression marked by surprise. He didn't ask how she had remembered the address, only stepped aside to let her in. Grace appeared from the bedroom, hair loose, smile wide, clutching a colorful drawing. She stopped when she saw Isabella and lifted her bright eyes. "You came back?" she asked simply, without hesitation. Isabella knelt down, showed her the book, and said she had come to read a story. The girl's excitement was immediate. She grabbed Isabella's hand and pulled her inside as if she already belonged there. The apartment looked the same, small, tidy in the ways it could be, carrying the smell of fresh tomato sauce. Isabella sat on the couch with Grace nestled beside her, the book open in her lap. Daniel stood against the wall, watching silently. As Isabella read through the illustrated pages, Grace leaned her head against her shoulder, giggling at the funny parts, asking questions about the colorful drawings. The simple closeness stirred something in Isabella she struggled to name. It wasn't only affection for the child. It was a reflection of all she had never experienced, warmth without judgment or expectation. When the story ended, Grace begged her to return with another book, and Isabella promised she would. Daniel didn't intervene, though his expression flickered between caution and quiet gratitude. When Grace dashed back to her room to fetch another drawing, Isabella and Daniel were left alone in the living room. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but thick with unspoken thoughts. Isabella admitted she often felt suffocated at the penthouse. Daniel answered that sometimes life weighed just as heavily on him, but at least he had his daughter to give meaning to the struggle. His gaze was steady but tired. Isabella noticed the fatigue etched in the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the stiffness in his shoulders from carrying too much. For a moment, she hesitated, then quietly offered help. She could ease some of the burden, open opportunities, ensure he wouldn't have to exhaust himself in so many shifts. Daniel's expression hardened. "I don't accept charity," he said firmly. "Grace needs to grow up knowing her father can provide for her on his own." His refusal wasn't harsh, but it was final. Isabella felt her chest tighten, torn between pressing the point and respecting his pride. She chose silence, swallowing the words she had left unsaid. Grace returned, waving a new drawing that showed 3 figures holding hands. "That's you, that's Daddy, and that's me," she explained, pointing at each colorful shape. Isabella smiled, her throat tightening. Daniel crouched down, studying the paper closely, and ran his hand affectionately through his daughter's hair. He didn't speak, but when his eyes met Isabella's, the exchange lingered, filled with meaning neither dared to put into words. The little girl asked Isabella to stay for dinner, and though Daniel hesitated, Isabella answered softly before he could. The child's innocent invitation blossomed into an unexpected evening of togetherness at the small kitchen table. They ate simple pasta with homemade sauce. Grace chattered endlessly, showing her drawings, asking if Isabella could sing or play. Isabella answered with patience, even laughter, genuinely enjoying herself. Daniel observed quietly, but his shoulders seemed lighter, his face more at ease than before. Later that night, after another story had been read and Grace had fallen asleep, Isabella stood to leave. Daniel walked her to the door, one hand resting on the frame, his expression serious. "I don't want you to feel obligated to come here," he said quietly. Isabella replied firmly that no one was forcing her, that she was there because she wanted to be. They held each other's gaze for long seconds before the door finally closed unhurried, carrying with it the certainty that something fragile yet undeniable was beginning to take root. Eleanor Montgomery watched her daughter coldly from the far end of the dining table in their Manhattan penthouse. The flawless porcelain reflected the light of the crystal chandelier, yet the meal in front of her remained untouched. Isabella tried to maintain composure, cutting small bites of salad, but she knew her mother's patience was running thin by the minute. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time away from the office after hours," Eleanor said, her voice calculated, sounding more like an accusation than an observation. Isabella lifted her eyes and held her gaze, refusing to look away. "I have my own commitments," she replied, offering no further explanation. Eleanor set her silverware down firmly and leaned forward slightly. "Personal commitments cannot put your family's legacy at risk. You're too young to understand, which is why you need stability. The engagement needs to be announced soon." Isabella drew in a deep breath, recalling the hours she had spent in boardrooms, the courage she had gathered to stand up to council members, and the freedom she felt when visiting Daniel and Grace. She knew she could no longer endure these impositions. Without fighting back, the words left her before she could stop them, but there was no turning back. Isabella declared clearly that she would not be forced into marriage just to protect an image. Eleanor's expression hardened, but she didn't move. "Do you really think you can run a corporation of this size on your own? Investors trust the Montgomery name because it stands for alliances and stability. You are not your father, Isabella." The sentence cut like a blade, but instead of shrinking, Isabella stood firm. "I don't need to be my father, Mother. I only need to be respected as a professional. I worked alongside him, I learned from him, and I will not let what I've built be reduced to a signature on a marriage certificate. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. Eleanor pressed her lips together, rose rigidly from her chair, and left the room without another word. Isabella sat still, her heart pounding hard in her chest, but a new fire burning inside. She would no longer be treated as a pawn on her mother's chessboard. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel was finishing a double shift. His body ached with fatigue, muscles burning, hands scratched and raw from heavy labor. When he finally came home, he found Mrs. Jenkins humming softly to Grace, who was already drifting off to sleep. The neighbor welcomed him with her usual warmth and mentioned that the little girl had spent the day asking about Isabella. Daniel stayed quiet, thanked her, and carried his daughter into the bedroom. Watching her breathe peacefully, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing even heavier on his shoulders. He thought about Isabella's offer to help him financially, remembering the look on her face when he had said he didn't want charity. He knew life could be easier if he accepted, but his pride would not allow it. He preferred long nights and empty pockets over giving anyone the impression that he was taking advantage. Still, the memory of her eyes lingered in his mind, a quiet insistence he could not shake. The next morning, Isabella arrived early at the office, determined not to let the argument with her mother destabilize her. She dressed soberly, tied her hair into a neat bun, and carried the folder of documents she had requested earlier in the week. In the meeting room, she felt the weight of skeptical stares but refused to falter. With precision, she presented the errors she had uncovered in contracts and made it clear that corrective measures were already underway. Some directors tried to question her authority to act without consulting Eleanor, but Isabella firmly replied that she was working fully within her responsibilities and that the meeting records would prove it. The meeting ended without applause, without congratulations, but also without objections. As she walked out, she took a long breath, aware that every step she took in that environment was a victory wrested by force. The absence of her father still haunted her, but now she found strength in something she could not yet name, a force that kept her moving forward even when solitude pressed in. Later that afternoon, weary from the relentless pace, Isabella decided to stop in Brooklyn before heading home. She knocked on Daniel's door and was greeted by Grace, who hugged her as though she had been waiting all along. The girl dragged her inside, eager to show off her latest colorful drawings. Daniel, in the background, was cleaning tools and looked up in surprise. "You didn't need to come," he said quietly. Isabella answered once more that she was there not out of obligation, but because she wanted to be. Grace insisted she read another story, and Isabella agreed, settling into a space that, though devoid of luxury, held a truth her own home never seemed to offer. Daniel watched silently, torn between gratitude and hesitation. There was something about Isabella that brightened the apartment, but also a risk he feared letting grow. When Grace finally fell asleep, Isabella and Daniel sat alone in the living room. He offered her coffee, which she accepted, and they sat across from each other. At the small table, Isabella spoke of her mother's pressure, of how suffocating it was to be treated as if she were incapable. Daniel listened in silence, nodding in quiet understanding. "No one can live your life for you," he said simply. The words lingered in the air, not as advice, but as a truth. Isabella felt the strength in him, a man who, despite the weight of hardship, refused to bend. Their conversation stretched late into the night, filled with pauses and glances that spoke louder than words. When she finally stood to leave, Daniel only opened the door and wished her good night. Isabella walked out quietly, carrying within her the certainty that something had shifted. She no longer needed to prove herself, only to her mother or to the company. She needed to prove, above all, to herself that she could choose her own path. The days began to weave into a continuous thread between two opposing worlds. Isabella spent her mornings and afternoons buried in reports, confronting directors, and making decisions many believed she wouldn't have the courage to take. But when evening came, or when the weekend finally offered her a pause, it was in Daniel's apartment that she found refuge. Grace grew restless with anticipation for her visits, running to the door at the slightest sound of footsteps in the hallway. The little girl insisted Isabella sit beside her during meals, hold her favorite book and read aloud before bed, and even help choose her pajamas. Daniel watched all of this with a mixture of tenderness and fear, aware of how quickly his daughter could grow attached, yet powerless to deny the new light he saw in the child's eyes. One evening, after a simple dinner, Grace begged Isabella not to leave. She pleaded for her to stay until she fell asleep, clutching her worn teddy bear. Isabella stretched out beside the girl, reading softly until Grace's small body finally relaxed into slumber. From the doorway, Daniel stood watching in silence, and the image struck him deeply. His daughter so peaceful, and a woman who was still almost a stranger, bringing serenity into their modest home. When Isabella returned to the living room, she found his gaze fixed on her, heavy with unspoken emotion. He didn't give a speech, only offered a brief "thank you." But inside Daniel, something shifted, a realization that her presence was already changing their lives in ways he was. Afraid to name Dot at the company, Isabella was also moving forward with steady steps. Meetings once marked by skepticism from directors became arenas of direct confrontation. She exposed weak contracts, cut unnecessary expenses, and presented reinvestment strategies no one had considered. Many were waiting for her to fail yet. Every meeting that ended in silence was its own victory. Gradually, Isabella was no longer seen as a sheltered heiress, but as an executive who knew exactly what she wanted. Still, those triumphs drained her. The tension only released when she left the glass tower of Montgomery Enterprises and crossed into Brooklyn, as if changing neighborhoods allowed her to shed a second skin. Dot in Daniel's apartment. She could relax her shoulders, laugh at Grace's endless questions, and even cook alongside them, improvising simple meals of pasta and sauce. In those moments, there was no rigid posture, no scrutiny, only a woman searching for meaning in what she was building, and a man who, despite his caution, was slowly learning to share his space. Daniel still feared Isabella might vanish one day, taking with her the smile that lit up his daughter's face. But each time she returned, defying his doubts, he found it harder to imagine pushing her away. Grace, too young to grasp adult complexities, spoke with disarming honesty. She said she wanted Isabella to take her to the park, to stay for breakfast, to help braid her hair before bed. She dreamed aloud about painting together every day or showing Isabella each new drawing she made. Every childish wish pierced Daniel, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Isabella, on the other hand, felt those innocent requests as a silent plea to remain. There were no easy answers, only the quiet truth that she was already part of their lives in a way that couldn't be denied. And so, between hard-won victories in cold boardrooms and shared laughter inside a modest Brooklyn apartment, Isabella realized two worlds so distant were slowly merging, not because she sought to escape one or hide in the other, but because both were becoming the reality she wanted to uphold. Daniel, though cautious, could not ignore how much his daughter's happiness now depended on the woman who had become part of their routine. There were no promises made, no plans laid out, but the bond was there, growing stronger with each gesture, each glance at the end of the day. The week began with Isabella stepping into a meeting that just a few months earlier would have been led by veteran directors without even asking her opinion. She walked into the room carrying a folder full of reports and laid out the latest. Numbers. Cost-cutting measures were already showing results. Deadlines were being met with more consistency, and investors who had distanced themselves were starting to return. A moment of silence followed, broken by cautious comments, until the chairman of the board declared that the data confirmed the credibility of the company's new leadership. Isabella didn't smile in triumph. She simply thanked them and reminded everyone that there was still much work ahead. As the directors left, she noticed their expressions had shifted, no longer condescending, but respectful. She left the room with her heart racing, knowing that each win there was a direct response to her mother's constant pressure. On weekends, she set aside her heels and the glass-walled offices of Manhattan. Crossing into Brooklyn, she spent hours with Daniel and Grace. There was no luxury, but there was ease. They walked to the nearby park, bought ice cream from street vendors, let Grace play on the swings while the two of them talked about life. Isabella laughed at the girls' stories, listened to Daniel speak about the daily struggle to keep up with bills, and sometimes turned her face away so he wouldn't see how much at home she felt in that setting. The contrast between corporate reports and chalk drawings on the pavement couldn't have been sharper, but it was precisely that mix that gave her strength to keep going. Daniel, though hesitant, could no longer deny how much those afternoons meant to his daughter, and, quietly, to him as well. It was during one of these outings that Isabella brought up the subject. Daniel always tried to avoid his work situation. She knew he took irregular shifts with no benefits, constantly at the mercy of the next opportunity. Carefully, she explained that there was an opening at the company, an administrative support role in the maintenance department with a steady salary, health insurance, and regular hours. This isn't charity, Daniel. It's a job that needs to be done, and you have the discipline for it, she said firmly, meeting his eyes. He tried to refuse, mentioning his pride and the fear of appearing dependent on her, but Isabella stood her ground. She reminded him that accepting didn't mean losing dignity. It meant ensuring stability for Grace. His expression faltered at the mention of his daughter. After a long pause, he muttered that he would think about it. Isabella didn't press further, but she knew the wall was beginning to crack. While Isabella gained ground at the company and strengthened her ties in Brooklyn, Eleanor began noticing her daughter's frequent absences. Realizing Isabella often left without explanation, she confronted her directly in the large sitting room of the penthouse. I've been hearing things about your routine. They say you've been spending time with people who don't belong in our circle, she said sharply, her eyes cold. Isabella held her gaze but stayed silent. Eleanor pressed on. You're degrading yourself, tarnishing the family's name. If you truly think you can lead this company, you can't afford to be seen with just anyone. It was the first time Eleanor voiced so openly the accusation that had long hung in the air. Isabella took a deep breath and replied firmly, My personal life is not a bargaining chip for business, Mother. I work every day to prove my ability, not to live up to social conventions. And no one will dictate who I can or cannot spend my time with. The tension escalated as Eleanor rose from her chair abruptly, her face tight with indignation. You're fooling yourself if you think you can keep this position without the board's support. I can lose patience and step in. Isabella, however, didn't flinch. The board already recognizes my work. The numbers speak for me, not your last name or your alliances. The room fell silent. Eleanor stood still, stunned by her daughter's defiance, yet unable to admit that her power wasn't what it once was. Isabella walked out with steady steps, her heart pounding but resolved not to retreat. For the first time since her father's death, she felt the leadership was truly hers, not imposed, but earned. That weekend, Daniel seemed more thoughtful than usual during their outing with Grace. As the little girl chased pigeons across the square, he admitted he had agreed to meet with human resources about the position. I still don't know if it's the right move, he said, but maybe it's time to think less about my pride and more about my daughter's future. Isabella smiled not with triumph, but with relief. It was proof that trust between them was growing, built not on promises or appearances, but on real choices. Grace ran back and grabbed Isabella's hand, asking her to push the swing. Daniel watched the two together, and for a moment, he felt that life, even with its hardships, could offer a kind of stability he had never thought possible. Daniel walked into the glass tower of Montgomery Enterprises for the very first time wearing the simple uniform of the support staff. He wasn't an executive, he didn't attend meetings, but he carried himself with the quiet pride of a man who knew this step was changing the course of his life. The maintenance and logistics department was busy but well-structured, and the contract he had signed gave him what he had never known before: a steady paycheck, health insurance, and regular hours. By the end of the first month, he already saw the difference reflected in Grace's eyes. She no longer found him worn out every evening. Now, he could pick her up from the community daycare Mrs. Jenkins had managed to secure, take her to the park without rushing, even sit at the table and eat dinner without glancing at the clock. The weight of running from one odd job to the next had lifted, replaced by the rare relief of stability. Isabella followed his progress from afar. She had no direct contact with Daniel at the company, but every now and then, while reviewing performance evaluations, she noticed his name alongside quiet praise: committed, punctual, reliable. She read those words with a silent sense of pride, never mentioning it to anyone. In the hallways, she maintained her role as the demanding leader, but outside those walls, she allowed herself to smile at the thought that, in some small way, she had helped reshape the routine of a father who refused shoes charity but embraced a fair chance. To her, it was a double victory, proving her capacity to manage a corporation while also building connections that stretched far beyond Manhattan's glass walls. Weekends became the invisible thread linking their separate worlds. Grace waited, eagerly, always ready with new drawings and new stories to share. This time, Daniel could take part with more energy. He walked his daughter to the park hand in hand, and Isabella joined them there. They didn't plan much, just improvised picnics, games on the grass, and conversations that drifted from the week's reports to childhood memories. It felt like they had stumbled upon a rhythm of their own, a space where it didn't matter that one came from a penthouse and the other from an old walk-up. What mattered was Grace's smile when she looked up and saw them both by her side. Daniel still held on to caution. He worried that the closeness could be misunderstood, that one day Isabella might vanish from their lives and leave behind a void too heavy for his daughter to bear. But over time, he realized she always returned, no matter how tired she was. That consistency chipped away at his defenses. With every laugh from Grace, every meal shared, every quiet conversation whispered in the small kitchen, the idea that they were becoming an unusual kind of family no longer felt far-fetched. Isabella saw herself in that role too, not as a replacement for Grace's mother, but as someone who had chosen to be there, offering care without asking for anything in return. At the company, Isabella's rise remained steady. Troubled projects were reorganized, contracts renegotiated, suppliers restructured. The board, once skeptical, now spoke her name with respect in external meetings. For her, each accomplishment carried with it the echo of Daniel's words, once she had held on to in her hardest moments: "No one can live your life for you." That strength was what kept her standing tall against Eleanor's constant disapproval, her mother still refusing to accept her daughter's bond with someone outside the family circle. But Isabella was no longer intimidated. On a Sunday night, after another weekend filled with laughter and drawings scattered across the living room floor, Isabella left with her heart full. Daniel closed the door behind her and looked at Grace, who still had her arms stretched out, as if reluctant to let her go. He smiled, scooped his daughter into his arms, and carried her to bed. The image stayed with him: the modest apartment, The colorful blanket, the crumpled papers covered in a child's sketches, and Isabella's presence woven into it all. There had been no declarations, no promises, yet the truth was undeniable. Between corporate reports and simple home-cooked meals, they had become an unlikely family, held together by trust, care, and the quiet decision to keep walking forward, even if the world failed to understand. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.